Hi, I'm Erdogan. Let me begin with the inescapable question. What does Dr. Jekyll desire? I think he's not ashamed to invent what he desires. The inventiveness is quite obvious. The respectable doctor does not really transform himself into his criminal other. Jekyll invents Mr. Hyde, and thereby his ambiguous self. The transformation begins with the drinking of what he calls transforming draught. But it does not end there. He drinks it not once, not twice, but again and again. Why? Simply because he has found in his other, in Stevenson's words, a sea of liberty. So he escapes to open-ended transformation. I argue that the escape, not the transformation, amounts to a political process, a process Deleuze and Guattari call schizorevolutionary. What I really want to talk about is this open-ended process Jekyll enacts. Yes, he does curse the ambiguity of his purpose, but at the end, precisely when Jekyll looks beyond that narrative end, ambiguity stands weaponized. It is by invoking his politically contingent link to Hyde that the good doctor brings the life of the unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. As such, beyond the certainty of death, relational ambiguity thrives. You may guess that the death of the inventive self is a narrative hint at the subversion of the self-other boundary. Jekyll's death, Jekyll and Hyde lives on. The narrative trick is schizorevolutionary insofar as it subverts the respectable criminal boundary and still submits to a bounded reality. As a non-binary invention, the Jekyll and Hyde myth does survive to haunt the binary reality. So what is metamorphosis? Obviously it's not mere transformation, but I think it can be grasped as an impossible trip across the boundaries that the criminological order implies. This trip is a circular movement, in this case from the unfamiliar Hyde to the strangely familiar Jekyll. Now, especially here, metamorphosis suggests an impossible desire, certainly as a narrative of transgression, and yet so as to effect an estrangement to the otherness that the criminological order implies. At the end of the day, Jekyll is no longer that much familiar. This is to say, his desire is now impossible in quite another sense. Hyde, the unborn criminal Jekyll has invented, is impossible in a non-binary sense, and thus he subverts the binary reality that the born criminal theory makes possible. As a speculative effect of the metamorphic desire, Jekyll and Hyde emerges as a strange possibility to suggest the ongoing turning of one's back on the familiar self. As the expression of a schizorevolutionary process, metamorphosis survives the either-or vernacular presumed by the Victorian criminology. In Stevenson's terms, this is to experiment with the profound duplicity of life. As to us, and in our terms, the experiment involves a narrative estrangement to the familiar-unfamiliar distinction. And I think it's in this Gothic possibility that Jekyll and Hyde both rebels and submits to the Victorian reality, say to the belief that criminal proclivities could be possibly quantified. Jekyll's really on a strangely possible trip, from the demarcation of the other to the fragmentation of the self, and back again. Now it is tempting to pathologize this boundary-crossing persona and imagine him at home in his schizophrenia. But that will be to miss the Gothic subjectivity he impersonates. Jekyll's metamorphosis is obviously a fictional case of dissociation from the Victorian reality. Much less obviously, though, it's a compelling case for estrangement to the criminological anxiety. The Jekyll and Hyde mythology rather than a case of split personality, is a case for becoming indifferent to the criminality-respectability split. It's as if one could abolish any boundary, but given an ambiguous enough subjectivity. So no need to pity the unhappy doctor. And I guess neither should we take metamorphosis as a symptom of something else. In any case, Jekyll's desire cannot be taken at its mythical words, but on their readerly effects. For one, metamorphosis affects a paradoxical response to an untenable situation, notably to the situation the discourse of murder formulates, to the untenable anxiety of that impossible other, supposedly hidden inside the possible self. The paradoxical response affects the blurring of the boundary that separates the possible from the impossible. So it's not enough to say that Stevenson's fictional metamorphosis involves a real paradox. Moreover, Jekyll's schizo escape is an actual encounter with metamorphic desire. When taken literally, metamorphosis attests to one's entrapment. But as a political process, it conjoins Jekyll to Hyde, submission to rebellion. Whatever fantasy Jekyll's chemically induced transformation into his other may imply, the strange Hyde is the means by which the doctor could escape himself, though as the mythical subject of a schizo escape. The 19th century criminological positivism fails to take Hyde for an object. We may expect that. But what we don't expect is that in this failure, Jekyll could succeed to escape the subject-object binary. In other words, Hyde could be the proverbial weapon Jekyll was looking for as he fled. Once again, the fear of inescapable vulnerability returns to entail not so much paralysis, but inventive rebellion. Jekyll invents his other, just not as he pleases. The good doctor's addiction to metamorphosis is an artful demonstration that we cannot take our own rebellion for granted. The metamorphic desire he thus enacts both subverts and is framed by the Victorian anxiety of the blackness within. Imaginably, the strangely familiar Jekyll was an active escapist, where he both perverted and replicated the equally strange born criminal, which is, by the way, the Italian criminologist Lombroso's then popular attempt to recognize the blackness within, that is, by profiling it. In contrast to Lombroso's familiar desire to capture otherness, Stevenson's strangely familiar Jekyll experiments with it. While everybody is trying hard to recognize the impossible Hyde, Jekyll had already subverted the meaning of impossible. Could this be an invitation to invent our very own Gothic other? Tellingly, Hyde, the invented criminal, eludes everybody except Jekyll, his fictional inventor. And in the perpetuity of this metamorphic desire, we could recognize the subversive impossibility of metamorphosis. Yes, we could take Hyde as a doppelganger, and thereby dismiss metamorphosis as a tame possibility. But if indeed the readers can't afford a non-binary relationship to otherness, except in Jekyll's desire, they stand introduced to a troubling experiment. When Jekyll, like an unruly schoolboy, finds shelter in his metamorphic other, the good guy can be said to enjoy a non-binary take on the bad guy. The dominant concern for the blackness within now appears as no more than a landing one could shake off in the ritualistic drinking of the transforming draught. And in the process, the unfamiliar criminality acquires a troubling familiarity. To approach the dominant take on otherness, Stevenson's fiction seems to take shelter in the impenetrable mantle of a schizorevolutionary process. If Jekyll is fiction, his metamorphic other is fiction within fiction. They both exist in a circular movement. From the blackness of Hyde, which is the least of our troubles, to the hidden blackness of Jekyll, which really troubles us when he seems to say, "Yes, I am your kind." And back again. The Jekyll and Hyde mythology does not retreat, obviously, to a pure locality, as would a conspiracy theory do. The circular act is that of a transgressive universality. It is true that open-ended metamorphosis could not offer a way out. Still it affects the crossing of the boundary that separates the out from the in. Metamorphosis suggests mythical transgression. At least that's the way Stevenson deploys it as a Gothic encounter, as the emergence of the familiar insider within the unfamiliar outsider. I'll take Gregor's dream. Before it could be deemed a revolt, it had to submit to the binary order of labor relations. Likewise, Jekyll's crossings to the wild end up with a strangely civilized subjectivity. Just as Gregor's metamorphosis enables him both to become free and to stay innocent, the Jekyll and Hyde fiction proposes us to hack into our own database reality, namely into the order of automated suspicion and algorithmic sorting. These literary tricks have, of course, a context. Remember that the historical audience of Jekyll and Hyde, much like us today, was already craving for, in Scott Jingle's words, a represented encounter with the racially other. Accordingly, Jekyll and Hyde is a represented encounter, with the impossibility to tell the self from the other. Where the criminological order believes in its other, Jekyll's Gothic blackness suggests a schizorevolutionary suspension of disbelief. No surprise then that the Doctor's flight is a perpetual oscillation between one of rebellion to the black and white order of the Victorian criminology and the ongoing invention of blackness. As a last word, here's a common take on this uncommon fiction. I quote, "Dr. Jekyll's transformation into Mr. Hyde is a frightening possibility." Unquote. I find in this proposition not only a Gothic horror, but also a political position. So I'd like to counter-propose that Jekyll's escape to metamorphosis is frightening, but for those who can't afford the process. The strange possibility of one taking shelter in one's mask, precisely in a society where the face is no longer on one's side, incites not only fear, but also estrangement. The fear is understandable, in other words. The fearsome Hyde is likely to be singled out as the radical other that refuses identification. But isn't this above all the case with the good doctor in our midst? Remember that Hyde, the invented other, frightens everybody except Jekyll, the radical inventor in our midst. Okay, before I go, one last disclaimer. If any troubling familiarity with Jekyll's desire arises, we may ascribe it to what Deleuze calls the schizophrenic vocation of literature. Thank you for listening.